All right, friends, thank you so much. My name is Reverend Ray Chen Huang. I'm senior organizer at Housing Now, and I'm so excited to have you all join us for this webinar or town hall that we are holding across the country about social housing. If you're wondering where you are to make sure you're on the right webinar, this is titled From Tenant Organizing to the Halls of Congress. Then we'll be talking about how we are advancing social housing nationally from the grassroots up. We have a really great group with us today. Unfortunately, we were hoping to be able to translate this from English into Spanish for those who might be monolingual Spanish speakers, but our technology is not working, so we'll have to host another one in Spanish soon. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. If you have a chance, if you can put your name and where you're calling in from today and what brought you here in the chat. It's not going to go to everybody, but it'll go to the panelists who will be speaking and give us an opportunity to get to know you and exactly who we're speaking to. So if you want to take a moment to do that, we would be so grateful so we can get to know you. I'm happy to share that we have a number of sponsors for this particular call today, and those are Policy Link, who's hosting this particular Zoom webinar. So thank you so much, Policy Link, Housing Now, a statewide housing justice coalition, Tenants Together, Climate and Community Institute, Urban Democracy Lab, Debt Collective. I am missing a couple, Social Spatial Climate Collaborative, also known as SC2. And I hope I'm not missing another one. Thank you so much for sharing about who you are and where you're calling in from, as well as why you're here today. We're excited to get to know you and to share a little bit more about social housing. Can you go to the next slide, please? So today you'll be hearing a bit from Daniel Aldana Cohen, professor at UC Berkeley, and executive director at Climate and Community Institute, as a founder as well of the Social Spatial Climate Collaborative Institute. He will be sharing and presenting on what is social housing. Then next we'll have Shanti Singh, who is the Policy and Communications Director at Tenants Together. Also from the San Francisco Community Land Trust Board, and she'll be sharing about some grassroots perspectives across social housing and how our grassroots leaders are leading the way in the developing movement of social housing on the ground. Next, you'll hear from John Paulo Bacchi, who is going to be the moderator of a panel where you'll hear from a couple of folks from across the country who are leading on efforts on social housing, as well as hear a testimony from Margarita from the Beverly, Vermont Community Land Trust. And lastly, we'll end with questions and answers.
Three big crises that we're tackling, I want to give you a bit of an academic kind of research overview of social housing and what we're thinking about and why we're fighting for it. And then Shanti and others will sort of get into the organizing nuts and bolts. Let me start with the three big crises that I see social housing as kind of taking on. First, supply. There's just not enough permanently affordable housing available in the US right now. There's probably not enough housing in general, but there's certainly not enough permanently affordable housing. And the existing programs to meet that supply are just not working, that supply need. Second, there's just so much price gouging. Landlords are hiking rent or evicting people from market rate low-income housing all the time. You also have the entrance of major corporations, private equity firms, buying up low-income housing on the market and getting people out. And finally, there's this interface of climate and energy and housing. I think a lot of us think that two of the big crises facing folks today are, on the one hand, the climate emergency, and we see this with Hurricane Helene right now, and then eviction. And we also see that utility bills are just too high. The carbon pollution continues to hurt folks' health at home. The people are exposed to climate disasters in the homes they're in now. It could go on and on and on, but we really need a solution that tackles these crises together. So this is something that I've been working on, and my friends at the Climate and Community Institute have been working on for some time. A couple of weeks ago, Rep. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Tina Smith released a big new bill based on our research at Climate and Community Institute on how to scale up green social housing. And Jean Paulo Bacchi led that research. He's on this call. You'll hear a little more from him soon. There's a lot of words on the slide, and don't worry about those. But I want to say, from my point of view, there's a few core principles here with social housing, and you'll hear more about this from Shanti as well. I think first, social housing refers to housing that is permanently protected from the speculative real estate market. And that's true whether we're talking about new construction or units that we're kind of saving from the real estate market, upgrading, and then giving over to groups like community land trusts or co-ops. Second, this housing is permanently affordable. It does not have affordability that expires, but it is permanently affordable. It's housing for folks with a wide range of incomes, and that'll build a broader social and political base. But most of these units will be provided for folks in the greatest need. Third, resident and community control is really central, and that holds across a whole set of different types of social housing we can imagine, whether we're talking about Section 9 public housing, senior housing, community land trusts, et cetera. Fourth, we're talking about strong resident protections to ensure stability and security. And finally, green social housing. It's resilient, it's carbon-free housing, it ensures climate safety, and it's about developing a high-road economy where the workers who build that housing are also, union workers living well as well. And I'm going to get sort of into that a little bit, but I just want to end this piece by saying, I think it's really essential for us to remember that social housing is about an ecosystem of different types of housing that meet diverse needs. It's not a single species of building. So there's not just one single kind of housing that is social housing, but it's about an ecosystem that meets diverse needs in diverse ways. Options for ownership, options for rental, cooperative, community land trust, public, social, many different ways of getting this done. Now, I've come to this perspective based on years of research all over the world. I've seen folks, like you can see on the left, who've housing movements that have worked within abandoned buildings to turn them into social housing, or as you see on the right here, also in Brazil, folks moving into new social housing projects, this one named after Nelson Mandela, that were built with public support under movement leadership. I spent a lot of time in New York talking to residents of New York City public housing, documenting all the ways that that housing has been neglected and abandoned, and working on solutions like the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act that would save public housing, which for us is a central pillar of social housing. We actually got most of this bill into Build Back Better, but as you know, that didn't pass. But this is a movement that is also very strong. I've spent a lot of time in Vienna, and some folks are sick of hearing about Vienna, but I'm going to say a little bit about it today. And the reason is that Vienna is the global capital of social housing. I think if we want to know what it looks like to really take a massive amount of housing off of the market, we should see what it looks like in Vienna. And what do we find? The lowest rents of a major city in Europe, lowest levels of rent burden. We find that over half the population lives in beautiful buildings, and this really increases the quality of life in Vienna to the point that The Economist magazine, the magazine of the 1%, has named Vienna the most livable city in the world for 3 years in a row. And actually, for people from migrant backgrounds in Vienna, the publicly owned housing is the best housing that they access and makes a real difference in their lives. In Vienna, I have seen beautiful new buildings with things like sliding walls so that the homes can adapt as families change. I've also seen decades-old social housing like you see on the right, where grandmothers, this woman is a migrant from Serbia, when she came to Vienna a long time ago, playing with their children, living really well in really high-quality housing. So it's not just the new stuff that's great. This is a generational project, a multi-generational project. I helped to organize a delegation of folks from New York City to Vienna a couple of years ago to visit and to kind of learn what they could. We visited old classic buildings. We brought people like the chair of New York State Senate Housing Committee, Brian Kavanaugh, but we also visited newer, greener buildings. This was really inspiring, and we spent a lot of time during this trip talking about, okay, what lessons apply back home, what lessons don't. Already, some of the lessons of this trip have been folded into a new bill in New York State for green social housing. And we brought along with us a journalist, Francesca Mora, who wrote a wonderful and super influential piece in New York Times Magazine about the lessons from Vienna. Now, we're going to come back in a minute to Vienna, but I want to talk about this. It's not that we are going to transpose that directly onto here, but there's a living exchange, a living conversation. I also hope that we can invite people from Vienna here in 10 or 20 years to see what anti-racist social housing looks like, which is, I think, something we have to do here in the US. I want to note that this is not just about one city, but all over the world, green social housing is at the cutting edge of architecture and design. The architects of the building you see on the left have won the Nobel Prize for Architecture, the Pritzker Prize, a couple of years ago, and they won it for cost-effective, super energy efficient, very beautifying retrofits to existing public housing. On the right, you see a project in the UK that a couple of years ago won a National Architecture Award passive house, super energy efficient, super healthy housing. And this is at a much smaller scale, townhouse size, the kind of thing you can imagine in many US suburbs. So there are all different kinds of ways to build the social housing, and all over the world, it is at the cutting edge. We are doing this in the US as well. On the left, you see the Roland Curtis Gardens. Could call that transit-oriented social housing. It's a community land trust built just 100 feet away from a metro station in Los Angeles. And to the right, a beautiful new senior housing project by the legendary architect Daniel Libeskind. Built to the highest levels of energy efficiency. So you're seeing this kind of bubble up here in the US, even if we don't have the full ecosystem. I want to come back to Vienna for a minute because I was just there again this summer, and I want to highlight something else. I think we need this movement leadership, but we have available to us, I think, an even broader coalition. People who will live in the housing and people who will produce the housing. Architects, laborers, plumbers, electricians, project managers. And what I want to bring this back to Vienna, and here is one of the projects that I saw there this summer. This has community gardens on the roof, massive bicycle room, extremely efficient, beautifully built housing. And what's interesting about it is when you have a social housing ecosystem, as in Vienna, you just find all kinds of people from all walks of life, professionals who've done things like project management, and they just have entire careers producing social housing. This whole unit was built by a union for white collar workers, and it's just basically a way of life. And I want to illustrate that once you get that social housing system going, that momentum, you really just get a kind of extraordinary set of talents that are put into place in service of building that working class housing for folks all around the city. So it's a really, really interesting way of, or put another way, what's interesting is when you have that system, you just have so many different social groups putting their talents to work. Another example of this, and here's an old building that I visited. This building is decades old. And basically what I'm seeing here is a system that they did for an energy efficient retrofit. And I'm not going to give you the whole technical details, but what's so interesting about this is a building from the 50s. And basically the chief plumber who worked on the building, that apparently they call Super Mario, came up with a totally innovative way of retrofitting the units. For a cost of $35,000 to $5,000 per apartment, they cut all the energy bills in half. And that giant machine you see on the right is a heat pump that puts clean, super cold water into the radiator system in the summer to cool the units, and of course, hot water in the winter. And so here's a case where it's really worker-led transformation of the buildings. And it's in that social housing ecosystem where instead of a logic of how are we going to make the most profit, the logic is how are we going to deliver the greatest good to the residents? And all kinds of people are putting their talents to work, making it happen. So, okay, I've talked a bunch. I think the thing with academia is that the more you learn, the simpler the story gets, ultimately, in my view. And at the end of the day, I want to leave you with this, that social housing, there's a lot one can say, but what it comes down to is a vision that puts people at the center of it, people who live in housing, people who build housing, people who operate housing. It's about diversity, meeting diverse needs with diverse kinds of housing. It's about beauty, it's about climate action, and it's about agency, not the kind of iron cage of the market, but the agency of normal people building a better way to live in this world. Please feel free to shoot me an email, and I'm happy to discuss this more. And now I will pass it off to one of the brilliant social housing thinkers and organizers of our times, Shanti Singh.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So excited to be here. My name is Shanti Singh, she, her. I am the legislative and comms director at Tenants Together. We're a statewide coalition, primarily of tenant unions, but other housing justice organizations in California. And we arrived at social housing the same way people across the country are, often through tenant organizing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this wonderful report that some of our panelists contributed to. It's called, if someone can actually put the link in the chat, that would be great. But it's called Building Our Future, Grassroots Reflections on Social Housing. And what we did was, we can go to the next slide. Actually, yeah, there we go. So what we did was this is not an exhaustive map of social housing campaigns in the United States right now, but this is who contributed to our report. And it's wonderful to see all of these different narratives because it's not really, we have contributors who are at different stages of their organization. They're trying different strategies. They're trying different policies. Some of them are just getting off the tenant organizing off the ground. Some of them are, going to their state legislature. It's not happening just in blue states or red states. It's happening all over the country. And so, yeah, I have a couple of couple of these folks. I'm just going to go through this list as quickly as I can. But in Seattle, Washington, they have the voters established a public developer of social housing. They're now fighting their city council to fund it. Here in the Bay Area, where I am, and across California, we have a growing ecosystem of community land trusts that acquire housing that's in danger of being reverted to the speculative market. We also have been studying and trying to see how far we can take municipal social housing and having those political fights and expanding rent control. In Los Angeles, they scored a major victory with Measure ULA. This is a massive coalition of labor and housing justice and faith-based and all sorts of community organizations who came together to pass a mansion tax, right? A tax on properties over, I think, $5 million on their sales to fund hundreds of millions of dollars in affordable housing. And specifically, a portion of it is earmarked for social housing. And we have a wonderful guest from LA who's going to talk about that later. I also have to shout out the Inland Empire. I think one of you is on here doing incredible work, setting up not just a tenants union, but a community land trust in the Inland Empire. Houston, the Texas Organizing Project, and others are doing amazing work with tenant organizing and in the face of climate disaster and making demands for affordable housing, social housing funds. The Kansas City tenants, we were hoping to have them on here. They're also fantastic. Some of you probably heard of them. They're making waves. Not just electing city council members who support social housing and tenant protection, organizing tenants in eviction court, but also seeing social housing as part of their political horizon and demanding and winning affordable housing funding. And in Chicago, there's a wonderful Green New Deal coalition, but also in coalition with labor and housing justice organizations who are currently trying to, not only support existing public housing, but also support new social housing initiatives. And they're also fighting for funding as we speak. Yeah, if someone can paste I'll paste the report in the chat later. Sorry, y'all. Kind of like busy right now. But if someone else could do it, that would be great. But anyway, sorry. And so moving on to the East Coast, we have Rhode Island also fighting at the organizing tenants locally and then fighting at the state level at the same time to establish a similar public developer like Seattle is. And New York, same thing, Social Housing Development Authority and the state legislature, which would not just fund support public housing, but also community land trusts and cooperatives. Connecticut, lots of tenant organizing and trying to take housing off of the speculative market. Sorry, I'm going through these very fast. So if you're one of the contributors and I'm being a little reductive, I'm sorry. Washington, D.C., also trying to push a Green New Deal for social housing in the city of D.C., building on an existing ecosystem of growing tenant organizing and their tenant opportunity to purchase. And Maryland, same thing. There's a lot going on in Maryland. There is, there's stuff going on in Montgomery County with the Public Housing Authority, but the Maryland tenant organizing for rent control and other protections to take housing off the speculative market is it's popping off there. So I just went through a really long laundry list. This isn't all of the campaigns. You can read more about it in our wonderful report. But it's not all social housing campaigns. While we were writing this report, more social housing campaigns popped up, which is incredible. Really, everyone's trying different strategies, and I'll get into that in a minute. But what really unites folks is this is not, like I said, this is not about red or blue states. This is not about whether you live in a multifamily building in a big city, or a mobile home park in the suburbs, you're a farm worker in rural housing. Social housing is for all of you. And when you're fighting in community with your neighbors for permanently affordable and dignified housing, you're part of a long history of demands for social housing and civil rights and economic justice movements across the country. Housing has always been a core demand for a lot of social movements in the United States. So social housing, I know it feels like a new word, but in a way it's as American as apple pie. And all the campaigns that we're seeing for social housing now, they're rooted in the history and the dynamics of the particular communities that are building those campaigns. They're also rooted in their cultural history of communities of tenants who know other housing systems besides the white picket fence we've all been told to believe in. But at the same time, those campaigns are growing the confidence to join with other campaigns and fight higher level fights against the real estate industry, both in confrontation and collaboration with state and federal governments, who ultimately need to have, we're organizing at the community level, but ultimately we also need to hold government's feet to the fire in giving us the resources that we need and deserve. So our challenge is not about having the same strategy everywhere right now. We have to try everything, and we have to try it in a way that responds to our community's urgent challenges. But the challenge we'll face, besides the real estate industry being the biggest one, but the challenge we face is to bring ourselves together in sort of mutual support and understanding while we build the network to strengthen more and support more local fights. Next time, I hope that this map has a little marker in every single state, at least one. So building out more local movements and supporting more local movements, but also building up to instigate, the fights for what are the resources that we need at the state and the federal levels. Can you go to the next slide? I only got 2, so. So this, and I'll ask in a couple minutes, can you just toggle between, the next one's in Spanish, so I just want to make sure that Spanish speakers can see it, but yeah, these are just some general buckets to kind of get folks thinking. They're not set in stone, but some of the types of social housing initiatives that we're seeing, and all our contributors fell into 1 or 2 or 3 of these buckets. There's the fight for funding and public investment, people passing progressive and anti-speculation taxes, passing taxes on real estate, taxes to basically fund affordable and specifically social housing, permanently affordable, permanently decommodified models of housing. There's also, there's bond measures, there's state level budget fights, and of course, investment dollars for existing social housing models, including existing public housing, which is a form of social housing, community land trusts, low-income housing cooperatives, and other models. So there's the sort of going for the money first, right? Because we need a lot of money. So that's one strategy. Another strategy that's also important is building government infrastructure. So some folks are saying, hey, we need to create new agencies. We need to create development authorities that are going to be able to, raise money, that are going to be able to get good financing. They're going to have the authority to fund all of these different models, right? And so some folks are actually going, again, to the state level or to the city level, going to the voters, going to their state legislators, and establishing development authorities. And some are also working through existing agencies, trying to say, look, existing government agencies don't always serve our needs, but they're there to serve the people. Let's try to reform them. Let's try to find partners in those agencies, who support social housing, who support building and buying and retrofitting and building new social housing. So there's the government infrastructure piece, because we do need that. And then finally, there's private market regulation. This is really important. I know Daniel talked about Vienna. I'm not going to talk about Vienna that much, but I will say that one thing, a big takeaway I had from there, besides how pretty the social housing was that they really can regulate the private market, and they think that's essential to having a thriving social housing ecosystem, because it is. So you might not necessarily not think about some things as social housing fights, like you might not necessarily think about Airbnb regulation as a social housing fight, or you might not even think about rent control, which is currently illegal, unfortunately, in 34 US states. You might necessarily not think about that as part of the social housing ecosystem, but it really is. And so having all of these programs, having all these tenant protections to stabilize people and also prevent, just unlimited speculation is actually really, really, really crucial when you're building up a social housing system. And it's obviously very important for tenants, because it is about stability, right? And then, and other sorts of, there's other kind of regulations. There's things like COPA and TOPA, that's community opportunity to purchase, and tenant opportunity to purchase, rights of preference, where basically you're saying, hey, I get first if there's housing that's about to be in danger and go on the speculative market, or tenants are about to be evicted, et cetera, the tenant or a community organization or the city or the government has the right to actually purchase that housing. Same, the fight for public land. We don't really use public land for public good a lot of the time. And keeping those lands in public hands and dedicating them to social housing is another really important form of, well, sort of private market regulation, but also kind of government regulation. The thing that all of these sort of buckets have in common, though, right? People are trying different ones first, or some mix of all of the above, or in some cases, some of these strategies aren't really available to people at the where they are right now and the politics of their environment, their community. But it's all rooted in tenant organizing and community demands, right? There's no one correct path to social housing. We're going to have to try everything. And local coalitions are going to have to respond to different local conditions. Like I said earlier, like it's, what's good for what's social housing for someone in Bakersfield is going to be different from someone in Pittsburgh, or someone, in rural countries, or someone living in the big city. It's going to be different, right? But what we need to do as we continue to organize, as we continue to build up new social housing campaigns, is figure out how we unify and support one another. And with that, I think that's all I got. So for now.
Thank you so much, Shanti, for sharing a little bit more about social housing. And at the end of the day, we can talk about policy and what is needed till we're blue in the face. But ultimately, if it is not actually impacting our everyday Americans and residents here in our beautiful country, then what is the point? And so I'm very honored to be able to introduce you to Margarita from the Beverly, Vermont Community Land Trust in Los Angeles to share about her story of how social housing has been able to impact her life directly. Because our interpretation is not working today, we are going to invite her to speak, and then we'll have consecutive translation immediately following her. So she'll speak first in Spanish, and then we'll have an interpreter translating that into English for us. So Margarita, I'd love to introduce yourself, have you introduce yourself. And Alexia, if you can help with supporting that process, that'd be great.
Ajá, y hola, Margarita, nada más si quiere presentarse.
Hola, mi nombre es Margarita Quintanilla y soy miembro de Beverly Vermont CLT. No sé si voy a dar mi testimonio ahorita.
Sí, nada más que lo que vamos a hacer es que si puede tomar pausas como después de como un par de oraciones, nada más yo para poder repetir como lo que usted diga al español.
Ok, ¿cuánto tiempo tengo?
She's asking how much time she has for her testimony.
Yes, 8 minutos.
Ok. Bueno, mi nombre es Margarita Quintanilla, soy miembro de Beverly Vermont CLT. Vivo en North Hollywood, California desde hace 8 años.
So hi everyone, my name is Margarita Quintanilla. I am a member of Beverly Vermont CLT, and I have lived in North Hollywood for 8 years.
Vivíamos separados con mi esposo, mi hija y yo rentábamos en un lugar, en un espacio pequeño, pues no era tan habitable, pero la necesidad de la vivienda nos obligó a rentar ese lugar, y mi esposo vivía en una casa de enfrente, rentando una recámara también. El dueño de donde vivía mi hija y yo nos pidió, porque se iba a llegar a vivir un familiar, y a mi esposo también le pidieron la recámara porque el señor le dijo que iba a vender la casa. Estábamos preocupados porque fue para tiempos de pandemia, mi hija y yo desempleada, solo mi esposo estaba trabajando, y muy preocupados porque no encontrábamos un lugar pues que se ajustaba a nuestro presupuesto. Luego el señor de la casa nos dijo que si queríamos rentar la casa y que nos la rentaba en $3,000, y nosotros dijimos, ¿de dónde vamos a sacar $3,000? Y quería 3,000 también como para down payment. Y la sorpresa fue que llegaron unas personas a ver la casa y nos dijeron que a mi esposo no lo podían sacar de la recámara porque había una ley que decía que no había que sacar a los inquilinos. Entonces, cuando nos dimos cuenta que Beverly Vermont era el que había comprado la casa, pues ellos nos dieron la oportunidad de tener una vivienda asequible y social, y no no solo nos dieron la oportunidad de estar en una recámara, sino que nos rentaron el espacio completo, toda la casa. Ahorita nosotros tenemos la oportunidad, tenemos el privilegio de vivir en una vivienda asequible y social, y esto me motiva a luchar para que muchas más personas puedan tener esta oportunidad.
So yes, so my daughter and myself, we used to live in this small space, and then my husband had a room that he was renting across from ourselves. And then the owner of those two places, he asked us to leave because he was selling the house. We were very worried because during the pandemic, we were not working, my daughter and myself, only my husband was working at the time. And we were very worried because we couldn't find a place that was within our budget. They said that they were going to rent the house to us for $3,000, and we just said, we can't afford that amount. So, to our surprise, the people that bought the house was actually Beverly, Vermont, and they said that they were not able to evict my husband. So, not only we were able to stay there at a low cost, affordable social housing, but we were also able to rent the entire building. So now we have the opportunity to live there, and that really motivates me to keep fighting for affordable housing for everyone.
Actualmente acabo bueno, estoy desempleada ahorita, estoy buscando trabajo, pero tengo la paz y la tranquilidad de que tenemos una vivienda social y asequible, y los costos de la renta son bajos, y los alcanzamos a pagar aunque solamente mi esposo esté trabajando. Eso nos ha dado seguridad, paz, tranquilidad, y las crisis hipertensivas de las que antes padecía pues han disminuido gracias a la tranquilidad de contar con esta vivienda, razón por la cual me gustaría seguir en la lucha y suplicar que donen los terrenos que están libres para poder construir más viviendas de este tipo.
And right now, I am actually not working at the time, but I really have a peace of mind that we have affordable housing, that social housing, that the cost that we pay is very low, and we are able to pay for that, and we afford it, even if only my husband is working at the time. And actually, my hypertension problems have subsided because we live here now, and that is why I want to ask and just tell people that whenever we can build more social housing, just take land for us. That would be really good for people.
Para cerrar mi testimonio, mi madre también vivía en otro lugar y ella había metido una aplicación para una vivienda asequible. eh, en el 2017 esperó y esperó por muchos años. En el 9 de agosto del 2023 ella falleció esperando la respuesta para obtener esa vivienda. Qué triste que trabajamos, declaramos nuestros impuestos, y cuando envejecemos no tenemos un lugar seguro ni digno para vivir.
My mom also applied for this kind of housing, and she actually waited too long. She passed away on August 9, 2023. It is really sad to know that she passed away waiting for something. And, us as citizens, we pay taxes, and we don't have the opportunity to have a housing that it is affordable and that we can, thrive in.
Agradezco la participación que me dieron y espero que este testimonio pueda ayudar para que puedan construirse muchas viviendas y que todos Los Ángeles, bueno, no solo Los Ángeles, el estado completo, el país, puedan tener la oportunidad de tener una vivienda digna, un espacio justo para que puedan criar a sus hijos, para que podamos tener nuestras mascotas, nuestras plantas, para que estemos cómodamente como lo estoy yo en la actualidad.
And well, thank you so much for giving me this space and for allowing me to share my testimony. I only wish for everybody here in Los Angeles, and not only Los Angeles, but also California and the country, for all of us to be able to have housing that it is affordable, where we're able to raise our children, our pets, and we have our plants, and we are able to live dignified lives.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much.
Gracias, Margarita. Thank you so much for being on and sharing your story and witness with us today. And we're hoping that many others are going to be able to share in that story as well in the future and be able to have the kind of housing stability and affordability and security that you have. Next on this panel today, on this town hall is a panel that we've moderated by Gianpaolo Baiocchi. He's professor of sociology at NYU, director of Urban Democracy Lab, a fellow at the Action Lab, and also architect of the Homes Act, which was just recently introduced by Senator Smith and Congressmember Ocasio-Cortez after 4.5 years of listening to grassroots community leaders across the country about what they need and how we can find a solution towards it. So I'll pass it on to you, Gianpaolo, to introduce our panelists and talk a little bit more about social housing and what's happening on the ground and how we're building it together.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, everyone who's come here. It's always a super honor for me to be in these spaces. And people who know me know that I say that all the time, but that's because I have a charmed life and I get to feel honored all the time being in the community spaces with the people who are making a change and making things happen and moving this country. We're going to have a conversation between Alfonso, Shanti, and Katie. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, but I wanted to say something. I thought Margarita's testimonial was so powerful. And I wanted to say something about the Homes Act, which my colleague Jake Carlson and I were very fortunate to have been consulted on. Architect is maybe too fancy of a word because we're not fancy people, but what we did do for a long time, it literally was 4 years, was a process of listening to people from coast to coast, as well as consulting with international people who do social housing from Uruguay to Finland. But the bulk of the work was listening to people. And, you know, there's this saying that the person who walks in the shoe knows where it hurts. You know, this is John Dewey. But our idea was that, well, the people who walk in the shoe should help us design a shoe that doesn't hurt. You know, like what is a kind of shoe and a kind of housing system that doesn't hurt? So, you know, the bill is a very long document, and I'm going to put my email in the chat for everyone. Jake and I are happy to come talk to you anytime, anywhere. People who write us from community orgs or activists or on the ground organizers, we always, we always take the time to respond, and it's important for us to listen. You know, Jake and I come from right to the city, and there's this saying, you know, professors on tap, not on top. Really, our job as academics is to be listening and amplifying and centering tenant voices. So this is why we have this amazing panel today. We're going to be speaking with Alfonso Directo, who's an advocacy director of ACT LA, which is an amazing coalition in Los Angeles County with 46 and counting community-based orgs. They've done work on housing and transit justice for a long time. My friend Shanti Singh, next, she's the lead director of Tenants Together. You've heard from her already, but I will say she's one of the people that I'm proud to call a friend and have on speed dial whenever I have a question. Tenants Together, for folks who don't know, is a statewide coalition of tenant unions in California. And importantly, she's a board member of the San Francisco CLT and shares San Francisco Housing Stability Fund Oversight Board. And then my other friend, Katie Goldstein, she's director of housing and healthcare campaigns at CPD, the Center for Popular Democracy, an amazing umbrella organization that has capacity to move people like nothing else in this country. So we're very proud and very happy to be in conversation with you today. So the first question we'll ask, and we'll go around, and I'll turn to Alfonso first. So can you please introduce yourself a little bit more? What are some of the housing challenges that you're seeing that are bringing you to social housing? And why social housing for you? What does that mean for you and the people that you organize with?
Thank you, Gianpaolo. Hi, everyone. My name is Alfonso Director Jr. I'm the Advocacy Director at ACT LA. And as Gianpaolo said, we're a coalition of community-based organizations here in Los Angeles, organizing countywide for housing and transit justice. Many of our organizations in our coalition are tenant rights organizations. We have public interest law groups like ACLU, Southern California in our coalition as well. And a lot of grasstops organizations advocating for policy change. At ACT LA, we came on social housing really in 2019 amidst the tenant rights struggles that we were very much part of and fighting for. As the pandemic set on in 2020, our members really felt the sort of the impact of both the affordable housing crisis and the pandemic on top of each other. And in the middle of rent debt fights, folks were getting behind on rent. In the middle of rent debt fights, we realized that under a system of housing that principally values commodification of housing, renters would never have the access to the dignified housing, something that social housing we came to later determine was able to give us that path forward. So really the two components here in Southern California, we define social housing as a modern approach to living in California, where homes are permanently affordable at all income levels and run by the residents who live there. So the two key components here is the permanent affordability and the tenant agency, the resident agency run by the residents who live there. And those two distinguishing factors are really what we see as the cornerstones of social housing that address a lot of the sort of fights that we are continually in for tenant rights and for tenant protections.
Thank you. Amazing, Alfonso. We'll definitely come back to you. So Shanti, let me pass it off to you. Same question. So we have tenant agency, permanently affordable, nice homes, modern way. What say you? What else do you say about your biography and why social housing for you?
Yeah, I think one thing that we really see at Tenants Together is, I mean, a lot of our different member organizations and tenant unions, they're fighting on organizing all sorts of different kinds of housing, public housing, low-income tax credit housing, mostly private housing, owned by a lot of times owned by slumlords or corporate landlords, right? But one thing and mobile home parks, right? But one thing is, even though that the landscape is different, that people, the kind of organizing that's happening in Bakersfield is different from the kind of organizing that's happening in Oakland, for example. California is a very big state. I don't need to tell anybody. But one thing that we see is that a lot of times when tenants reach a sufficient, maybe sufficient's the wrong word, but a level of organization and confidence in what they're doing and the organizing that they're doing, and a level of solidarity. A lot of times it can, even when a fight starts with, oh, okay, the whole building got a 25% rent hike, or my mobile home park is being sold to a speculator, et cetera. At some point, this demand keeps coming back up, and it comes up in different forms, right? Which is why we kind of think about this big umbrella of social housing. At some point, the tenants get together and ask themselves, wait, why does this slumlord, why does this corporate landlord, why does this speculator even own my housing at all? Can't the city buy it? Can't the land trust buy it? Can't we own it ourselves, right? And so seeing all of these different demands coming organically from different parts of California, people responding to different conditions, but a lot of times you get to a certain point in your organizing where you're asking yourself that question. And so for me, as we're primarily a base building coalition, but for me as the policy person, I'm thinking, what do we need to do to make sure that there is an ecosystem that when that comes up, that we can buy that building, we can turn it into a co-op, we can land trust it, or we can build, support existing public housing, fund existing public housing, and build new housing for folks who face eviction and displacement. So that's where it's coming from us. And I think that's where it's coming from a lot of people, where it's you just get to that point. You're like, wait, this awful person does not need to own this housing.
Oh, amazing. Thank you. And thank you for introducing to me land trust as a verb. Let's land trust it. I love that. Katie, where do you come down on this? I suspect you're in broad agreement with a lot of what's been said so far.
Very broad, and it's really great to be with everybody today. I'm going to give a little bit of background about the Center for Popular Democracy,
Please.
a little bit about how we came to this. So we're a national network of 51 power building grassroots organizations across the country in 33 states and cities. Our affiliates members are Black, Brown, immigrant, and working class. And our folks are facing really, really deep housing insecurity and houselessness, right? So, like, we're in a situation right now where many of our affiliates members will not be able to live in their homes in the next 5 to 10 years. So, we see this as being an incredibly serious crisis. And we see the root of that crisis as being that housing is a commodity, right? And the financialization and speculation in the housing market and the rise of corporate landlords is that cause. So, part of the work that we've been doing at CPD is over the past 3 years, we've organized a mass tenant union of tenants who live in corporate owned properties. We have over 21,000 members all across the country called Renters Rising. And so, Renters Rising folks got together and they had the similar path that Shanti's talking about, right? Is that, okay, why do we have corporate ownership of our homes where their entire investment model is to try to displace us and raise our rents and evict us? And so we really see social housing as a different vision for the housing market that says we want to decommodify housing and we want to make sure our folks are actually able to live in dignified, safe, secure, and affordable housing. So we were doing all this Renters Rising organizing, and then about 2 years ago, the entire CPD network got together and said, what would it mean for us to throw down together on one issue and create a campaign where we're flexing our power so we can win and deliver for our base? And housing was the top issue facing our members, which isn't a surprise for anybody that's doing housing organizing across the country. And so that's where the House Everyone campaign came from, which is a campaign for green social housing. And we have a variety of demands and support that we're doing at the local, state, and federal level. But I really want to talk about why we're focusing federally, right? And why we think that that's critical. And the reason is because the money. Right. We need an enormous amount of resources to be able to actually win these fights. And at CPD, we also care deeply about scale. And so we want to make sure that we're actually transforming the housing market alongside all of our comrades at the state and local level. And we think that the key to that is really to be pressuring the federal government. So we've been doing an enormous amount of organizing. In the past 2 months, we've actually mobilized thousands of people. 20 of us got arrested last week in a big action trying to pressure the next administration and all levels of government to take action on housing. And I think we're breaking through, right? Making this a serious issue in the presidential campaign. We've also launched an initiative called We Rent, We Vote, which will be mobilizing key voters in swing states to make housing a critical issue. So this is a lot of work that we're doing, and what we need to be doing more of is flexing our political power all across the country to actually have real wins for our folks.
Oh, amazing. Thank you. Well, let me pick up on something that Katie said and turn to Alfonso. So Katie, talk about focusing federally and the argument for that. Alfonso, where are you seeing at ACT LA opportunities to move for social housing?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, ACT LA, our focus to see social housing through is through Measure ULA, which Shanti had mentioned in her presentation, was a major win for us here in Los Angeles. Part of the outgrowth of a lot of that organizing work that I was referencing in my introduction in the pandemic was a really large coalition beyond even ACT LA of over 200 plus community organizations that got together during the pandemic over Zoom and wrote a ballot measure called Measure ULA that funds tenant protections, homeless prevention programs, as well as affordable housing production programs with a 30-70% split. And in that 70% bucket of revenue, there's a set aside for social housing. The revenue comes from a transfer tax, a tax of property sales, property transfers, not just sales, but property transfers over $5 million at 4.5%, and then 5% over $10 million. So really taxing wealthy properties. wealthy property owners. And that money comes into homeless prevention programs, into affordable housing production programs. And for us, it's really seeing Measure ULA implemented, getting the money, the close to $100 million per year that'll come in through this revenue stream for social housing, that it gets used in a way that builds permanently affordable community-controlled housing here in LA.
Oh, very nice. And thank you for mentioning Measure ULA. Now we have a federal idea. We have Measure ULA. Shanti, you mentioned land trusting it. What do you see as like opportunities in front of you for social housing from where you're sitting at Tenants together?
Yeah, I mean, we're trying, like I said in my presentation, we're trying everything. The thing about land trusts, there's I think 60 land trusts in California now, some amazing amount. It's grown really fast, although they all need a lot of money. I think, you know, the reason that sometimes that's the most the opportunity that people talk about first right now is because it's there. It's going to take a lot more time and effort to build, to actually get into like housing production. Although some people, again, are trying it with these development authorities, et cetera. So I'm not saying it's impossible, but a lot of times, like, you know, at least land trusts are there to respond to kind of like sometimes crisis situations where you can't acquire every building, but these are like tenants in a state of emergency. I mean, I am a rent controlled tenant myself. There are laws in California where my landlord could sell the building and have everyone in the building, including me, evicted, right? And those tend to be the people who go to the land trust here in San Francisco, where we have a ton of multifamily rental housing. But of course, it looks different in different places. So that's kind of why we'd like, at least in California, I'm not saying this is true for everybody else, but land trusts are kind of, they're often responding to emergencies when they're acquiring housing. And of course, they don't have enough funding at all, like not even close. But there are also, you know, other opportunities. Like I'll let Alfonso talk about LA in ULA. But you know, we are trying our best to actually, and one thing that keeps coming up in conversation, I'm talking to more people about it, which I'm getting really excited about, is that there are allies, like there's opponents and allies in the traditional affordable housing industry and in the government, in government agencies. And there's a lot of folks who are saying, you know, like really quietly, like, I really like social housing. I think our housing agencies should be working on it. The institutional structure is such that like, I can't say that so loudly right now, right? Or, you know, like, but you know, this is really something that we should be doing. There's a lot of affordable housers who say like, look, the low income housing tax credit is just not enough. We need more. We need to try other things too. And so that's where I do see a lot of opportunity. It's going to take time and it's going to take a lot of hard work. But I do think that there are, in addition to building out a land trust ecosystem that can acquire housing, that can decarbonize housing, and then in addition, of course, there are fights like the Hillside Villa tenants in Los Angeles who are trying to get the city to buy their housing. So it's not just land trust. But you know, at the same time, I think there is emerging sort of momentum, and it's kind of quiet right now, but there is momentum among like potential allies in government and in the traditional affordable housing industry, that they want to do something different and they want to put the power of the state to that.
Oh, very nice. And so this is a perfect opportunity to turn to kind of organizing questions. But I'm so glad, Shanti, you mentioned how diverse the fight for social housing is and the kinds of things that people are trying. You know, we could have had folks here from Kansas City Tenants Union. We could have folks here from Inquilinos Unidas in Minneapolis. We could have had folks here from Real Estate, resident-owned community in North Adams, which I just learned about. There's lots and lots of super creative experimentation that looks very different in place to place. But something all three of you have said is the importance of the agency in this being driven by the people who are experiencing it. Even the federal version of this is not about a federal thing that's going to imprint the same everywhere. It's about federal ways of enabling all this amazing creativity and organizing. But Shanti, you said something that I love. I would love to hear everybody on, and I'll return with this more provocative framing to you. And let me turn to Katie. So this question of allies and opponents is a super interesting one when we think about social housing. One part of my brain always thinks, well, social housing would benefit everybody and it's a good idea. It should be easy to do. Another part of my brain thinks, there's a lot of people used to business as usual, affordable housing, or simply poverty and apartheid like we have. You as an organizer with this amazing view nationally, where do you see this opponents and allies and opportunities question?
I think that there are a lot of opportunities. And I think part of that is like the real hunger that is from the ground and from the people, right? For a really different way of living that isn't just this continue emergency, right? Of crisis, right? People are seeking stability, they're seeking dignity, and they're organizing for that. They're organizing for beautiful housing, for permanent housing, for things that they can actually have this kind of generational family structure within. So I think that there's this hunger that's happening. There's also been a mass resurgence of tenant organizing that's happened over the past couple of years, right? Like truly mass numbers. And this is the type of thing that we're watching and we're seeing, and we have to push even more on to try to create the political crisis that needs to be responded to. I also think that there's a lot of ways to build with the climate justice movement about green social housing, right? The new structures that we want to create for our housing movement are energy efficient, are climate resilient. These are important people for us to work with. And I think there's a piece around labor and construction and good jobs and all of those different areas that we really need to think about this in a comprehensive way. Our opponents will always be the profit-driven real estate industry, right? And all of the elected officials that work on behalf of them. And I think that we also have to divorce this idea that a for-profit market can actually solve the housing crisis. And I think that's part of our both grassroots work and our more public work, to be clear that we're actually trying to create new public institutions that need to have good infrastructure, that need to be owned and operated by the folks who actually need them, and need to be resourced in a way that actually means that they can be good for the folks that are living there too.
Oh, lovely. Alfonso, what say you on this question of opportunities, opponents, allies?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, ditto everything Katie said, and just a couple things that really came to mind while she was speaking was how being connected nationwide really will help us learn from the bright spots that already exist to create this kind of infrastructure for social housing nationwide. A couple examples I want to just point out are that a lot of the capacity building work that we're trying to learn from and build here for social housing is coming off of a group in New York called UHAB, the Urban Homesteading Assistance Board. They have an incredible infrastructure of supporting tenants and co-ops, residents and co-ops around like property management, governance of buildings, not just setting it up, but sustaining that ecosystem. And we're just really inspired by UHAB and the work they're doing. So we're really looking to build something like that out here. And then on the issue of permanent affordability, the entire state of Vermont uses LIHTC dollars, the current predominant source of affordable housing funding in the nation. They use it in a way that all their buildings are done to keep permanently affordable covenants. So that way there's not this expiring covenant crisis that happens at the end of whatever, fictional term our states put on the use of LIHTC dollars. So being connected nationwide is really a strong suit and opportunity here. And I'm really excited for webinars like this to kind of introduce myself and to be connected with many of you all to serve this purpose. Social housing is really about connected communities also. It's about being connected internally with tenants of your neighbors in conversation to be able to solve issues together. It's about being connected externally to your region and your neighborhood with transit-oriented communities. And it's being connected nationally, like on this call. So I think organizing this way is really gives me a lot of optimism and hope. And I look forward to kind of staying connected with folks here.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for mentioning UHAB. When I go on these calls, you can't see there's a little note here that says, don't talk about New York examples. These are West Coast and national folks. But UHAB does amazing work. Some of the cooperatives they support, some of these limited equity co-ops are incredible examples. To me, they're much more powerful than Vienna, to be honest with you, as far as proof of concept that something has been working for decades. It's, you know, diverse, wonderful, permanently affordable, and it works. It's like, look, it actually just takes startup funding and a little bit of public backing. UHAB, thank you for mentioning that. Shanti, anything else you want to say on opportunities, allies, and opponents?
Well, I talked a little bit already about potential allies. We definitely do need to cultivate allies in government. That's really hard. And again, in the traditional affordable housing industry, or like there is some excitement and momentum there, but it's also going to be hard. And some of the report talks about some of like the different postures that traditional affordable housing sector has taken towards social housing, sometimes collaborative, sometimes hostile. But honestly, I don't have much other profound things to say besides that our number one threat is the real estate industry. They oppose all of these policies. They oppose the taxes. They oppose the rent control. They don't want you to touch you don't want social housing anywhere near the precious single family home zoned neighborhoods. We've already kind of seen that in terms of opposition to even like sort of like we had opposition to a study bill that we did at the state legislature. Yeah. You know, where there's like, we don't even want you to study the idea of putting social housing in high resource neighborhoods. So we don't even want you to study the idea of like, you know, putting social housing in a single family home neighborhood that will threaten our profits. So, I mean, that's who we're going to be up against. And, you know, I mean, I think it's important not to think that feels really daunting because of course it would. Like it's the real estate industry, the global real estate industry. But at the same time, I think like one thing, I mean, when we talk to tenants about rent control campaigns, right? Where like, you're not necessarily going to win the first time, you're going to have to keep fighting. But one thing, again, really don't want to name drop Vienna so much, but just one thing that was an important takeaway for me was they don't think about it like, oh, we built this social housing system and everything's wonderful and there's gardens on the rooftops and like schools and it's transit adjacent, it's lovely, we're done. All right, mission accomplished. That's not how they think about it at all, because they know that the real estate industry and speculation is constantly encroaching on their system too. And they know that they have to keep fighting. Like it is a continuous fight. It's not really like there's not going to be a moment where it's over. It's not over for them. They don't see it that way. Including like when they're complaining. Sometimes they're complaining about the same landlords that our member organizations are complaining about, like Greystar or Blackstone, right? Which was crazy to me. But yeah, I mean, it's thinking about it as, you know, an ongoing, like it's about building tenant power. It's always going to be an ongoing struggle. Even when we have this beautiful housing, the real estate industry is still going to try to mess with it. So we got to get used to it.
Yeah, I have to say, just a +1 on that. I know I'm the moderator, but I have to say the unwinding the influence of the real estate industry on our politics, you know, they donate equally to both major political parties, by the way. In New York, they own so many elected officials, including this disgraced, soon-to-be former mayor. They fund so many of research centers and professorships and so much of the ideology. It's really very, very pernicious. Let me ask a final question. I want to there's a bunch of questions that I wanted to ask of the audience to you, but I wanted to also give you a chance for a call to action. What should be done? There's a lot of people on this call who are very inspired. Katie, what should be done?
So the Homes Act is a really exciting first step for our movement for social housing. A lot of folks worked on it. It's pretty exciting that it got introduced. We would love for folks to call their legislators to try to get co-sponsors. I think we're going to put a link in the chat to every action for folks to actually do it. Please send it along to your network so we can show this kind of broad federal support. And of course, we want folks to organize, right? Organize your building, organize your block, organize with your folks, with your community organization. If the election goes the way that we want it to, you know, there could be a really important opportunity for us to win on housing. We're talking a lot with our folks about trying to build up a Build Back Better on housing and think about it as a really big opportunity for us to get mass resources out to communities. And so we would love to partner with everybody and anybody on that. And of course, that will be like an all hands on deck situation. And we'd love to have you all involved in that for us to really transform the housing market in this country.
Amazing. Alfonso, what should be done?
Organize. I just think talking to your neighbors, your family, your friends, especially as the end of the year here is coming up, about the need for affordable housing and taking action, as Jasmine pointed out, and calling our legislators, representatives at all levels, but particularly here to support the Homes Act, because it's getting a lot of momentum and it's really exciting to see. Thank you.
Shanti, what say you?
Obviously, from the tenant organizing coalition, of course I'm going to say organize the tenants. But also, I mean, especially like I do want to say too, as one of the policy dorks, not the only one here, but if there are any policy dorks in the audience, or you don't have to be a credentialed policy dork, like a lot of people are policy dorks, but if you are, and you're in spaces with elected officials, you're in spaces with labor and climate justice, you're working on something else, like talk to them about social housing, because we really need a really broad alliance. This isn't just a housing issue, it's a climate issue and it's a labor issue, right? And a lot of the reason you see a lot of interest from labor, which is very exciting, in social housing is because of the principle of wages got to go up and rents got to go down, right? So yeah, I mean, whatever community sort of spaces that you might be working in, if you are working in this, again, not necessarily professionally, but you could be inside of work, outside of work, whatever, start talking to folks about it, about social housing, and see, you might already have a coalition to start with and not know about it. So.
Amazing. So bottom line, organize, all nerds and all hands on deck. Talk to your neighbors, follow the links that we're going to share with you. That's amazing. So there's a couple of questions that have come in. There's many of them. But there's one thread that I would love to hear the three of you on, which there have been a few questions about public housing. Where does public housing sit for you in this discussion? And let me turn to Katie first.
Public housing is a core part of social housing, and it should be deeply funded, and we should pass the Green New Deal for public housing, and that's part of our key demands also. And so I think that it's really important for us to be thinking about all the diverse ways that we can have social housing, and public housing is definitely a key component of that. And we need to make sure that the folks that are living in public housing are able to live with dignity, which many are not because of the repairs issues that have happened for so long and the deep underfunding that's happened.
Shanti, what do you think?
Wait, ask the question again. I just want to get in the right headspace.
Well, there have been several questions about how it relates to social housing. Is it the same thing? How to fix? Where do you see it? And in organizing, in particular, in New York, this is it's a third rail. We have to talk about public housing when we talk about social housing and what we mean. How does it connect to you?
I have a very strong opinion on this, and this might not be everybody's opinion, so I'm just going to preface that. Public housing is social housing. And I think there's a lot of times people think about, it's totally understandable because there's so much stigma around public housing, which I sometimes the stigma around public housing, the issues that public housing happened because we segregated it and we didn't invest in it. And also I don't want to speak in the past tense because there is still public housing and there are still tenants organizing to get investment in their public housing. So, it is a form of social housing. And I think sometimes it's easy to think okay, well, we want to talk about social housing as not your grandmother's public housing, but it is. And I think we're already, no matter what you do with social housing, there's all of this, you will have opposition from the real estate industry, like we talked about, but also it's some of this is a narrative shift, right? We have to we've all got the white picket fence drilled into our heads. I sometimes say that HGTV is housing Fox News, right? We all have it. We all have those internalized thoughts, and there's a lot of stigma around public housing. But we're not going to get around. We need public investment for all of these models. We're not going to get around that. We need consistent public investment. We need tenants to be organized and supported in fighting for the resources that they need in every type of housing, and that includes public housing. So a lot of the things that I think people think they can avoid with existing public housing, that's just part of the bigger challenges that we need to face. What happened to public housing could happen again. And that's why we're getting organized. And that's also why we're bringing in existing public housing and public housing tenants into this fight, not leaving them behind.
Alfonso, how does public housing feature into your organizing around this issue?
Yeah, it's both. We need public housing and we need social housing. And as we build social housing, the kinds of agency, the kind of tenant organizing that is really fundamental to social housing, we need to kind of bring that same kind of infrastructure and heft into public housing and organize for operations and maintenance that is needed there. In so many ways, like public housing already has the component of being on publicly owned land, and that is fundamental and key. And so we need to just do the second part, which is the resident agency, where that has been so much removed from folks through our policies. So.
Yeah, very nicely said. I do feel when we have these social housing discussions that to separate social housing from public housing, as people do in conversations sometimes, is such a bad move. And I think it's important for us as a narrative to like own this. The U.S. is, as Shanti said, is nicely put. You know, it is the U.S.'s original social housing, and it's been underfunded because of the same real estate interests we were just talking about a second ago. How about this other question that has, this is a nerdy question, but I think it's a good one, and I'll ask Shanti first. So if we're thinking about this social housing ecosystem, to use a word that's been talked about in the conversation so far, if you look at places that have it, they have a kind of like long-term financial planning, like in Vienna. They are thinking out in terms of decades. They have public developers, they got public banks, they have public credits, a lot of stuff. How would a U.S. municipality, how would that grow, or how could that come to be in the U.S.?
Yeah, that is, I hate saying I don't know. I mean, no, there's a public banking movement that's growing, although like right now there's one public bank in North Dakota, which has been around for about 100 years, but there's definitely public banking is popping off, certainly in California, and I'm sorry to be so California centric, but I live here, but also in other parts of the country. I think that, like, I don't want to think about it. I think what it looks like, and I think that we're seeing with the growth of these development authorities, that model in particular, right? Like it faces a lot of challenges, but it's trying to be like a bucket for the financing, and it's also trying to use the leverage that the state has, like the broader concept of the state, the government has, to actually secure favorable financing terms, right? I think like all of these different, whether it's public banking, whether it's trying to set up a development authority, whether it's like certain bonding strategies that people are trying, I know it gets really wonky and in the weeds, but it's kind of rooted in the idea that like, we do believe that the government has the capacity to actually like, it regulates the financial market. There is no financial market without government. And so like, how do we find ways to actually use the power of this to like get, to get honestly better financing on affordable housing and on social housing? So I think that like that, but the institutions through which we do that, I mean, that's going to be, I think that's an open question. Is it going to be like some kind of government agency? Like, what's the financing going to look like? Like, it could look really different. There's people experimenting with things like revolving loan funds. There's a lot of different strategies out there. So that's a long-winded way of saying, I don't know exactly what it's going to look like. But I mean, given that we're in a country, it's like we subsidize 25% of the, like, I think of multifamily housing, or it might be 25% of rental housing is subsidized. Private rental housing, for-profit rental housing is subsidized by the government, right? The government subsidizes housing on favorable financial terms on a massive scale through mortgages, through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, right? We're subsidizing landlords and private property owners and homeowners all the time. That's where most of the federal spending on housing any given year like happens. So I do want to just say, I know this is a common theme that I'm talking about where I'm like, it seems daunting, but it is doable. We just don't we have to frame it that way because we're perfectly capable of creating a favorable financing system for private for-profit ownership of housing. We can certainly do so for social housing.
Katie, what do you think? I feel like CPD has a thought on public banks.
Yeah, we love them. And I think that, I mean, I really just want to echo what Shanti's saying. Like, I think that we need the infrastructure, right? And like we need to have a deeper bench, honestly, to like build the infrastructure on the left, on folks that care about social housing, right? And I think that a fear that I've had is we win a bunch of money for social housing and then it goes right back into the same for-profit corporate
Yeah.
owners and LIHTC and all of these programs, right? That are created for a for-profit industry. And so I think that the divorcing of the for-profit industry from the housing is like a really big challenge and will require an immense amount of infrastructure building that will happen at local, state levels. And I hope to partner with many people who are doing extraordinary work on cooperatives and community land trusts and are trying to figure out how to create government agencies and all of these like extraordinary things to make sure that we're actually going to meet the problem at scale. But that is a large area that we need to lean into as a movement.
Yeah, very nice. Alfonso, do you have thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, so part of Measure ULA, when we wrote it, we wrote in some percentage to actually fund the LA Housing Department. So there's some funds that we were also setting aside for the capacity building of the institution of government because they are the stewards of a lot of this. And then secondly, we're working with a lot of council members to help build up financial institutions, community serving financial institutions to support the idea of co-ops at scale. So we're organizing with community development finance institutions, CDFIs, credit unions, to be able to name the need for them for products like cooperative loans, so folks can be able to have enough funds, capital to be able to join cooperatives and things like that. So yeah, infrastructure building is very much a part of the work here as well. Thanks.
Oh, very nice. And I want to ask one final question, but I have to get another California shout out. In doing this listening, we ran across a national cooperative bank, which was a invention or a bill by the late great Ron Dellums. And it's now operates as a semi-private bank, but it operates as a public bank with a specific goal of funding and financing cooperatives. And they were real leaders in financing some of the early resident-owned communities when people in manufactured homes collectively own. So, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we, as Katie was saying, we need to kind of like bring together and make this bench. So let me ask this last question since we have a couple of minutes only. And this is to you as organizers doing the one-on-one or doing at a meeting. What is a tough question that you get from a skeptic? What's your favorite tough question from a skeptic? I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about it. And what is your answer? Really tough one. Not an easy one. I want one of those that like, okay, so Alfonso's smiling the most. What's your tough question and what's your answer?
I'll start. And if this is not tough enough, you got to let me know. But I always
I
get,
will.
what's the difference between affordable housing and social housing? And I just quickly say it's permanent affordability and resident agency. It's about being able to control like what the rules are of the building. What do I want to paint my walls? I want plants in front of my house. I want to have a community garden. It's about, that tenant agency. And it's about permanency, multi-generational housing stability and security that we're affording folks. Thank you.
That's pretty tough. I give it 8.
Thanks.
Katie, what's your tough question?
I get a lot of versions of this question, which is, green social housing's wonderful vision. How is it going to impact me today, right, or tomorrow? And I think the answer that I try to have is that we're, in a long struggle to get the housing that we deserve to transform the housing market, and we will win other things along the way that will mean that we'll be able to win more stable and dignified housing, even if we're not getting to that full vision. And that the way to do that is becoming together with your neighbors and organizing and building power.
Oh, that's a pretty tough question. That's a good one. Okay. 8.5. Shanti, what's your tough question?
How are you going to pay for it? Which is the question we get for everything, right? And how do you make sure it's not going to be defunded, right? It's the same question you get if you're talking about Medicare for all. It's the same question people asked about Obamacare. It's the same question people ask about pretty much any sort of social safety net thing. How are you going to pay for it? And the besides talking about the fact that like we can pay for, we're the richest country in the world and we can pay for things if we want to. There's plenty of things that we pay for that are very expensive and maybe not a good use of our money. But in terms of how do you prevent it from being disinvested in, and I think there's like it goes back to connotations about public housing, right? And that is through organizing, it's through building a political constituency. It's not different from any other social program that we've accomplished in this country that way. It's not that different from Medicare. It's not that different from Social Security. And the reason that those programs, you know, they've come under attack a lot, but the reason that at least like to some degree they have been managed to stand the test of time is because of their universe, because people love it and people don't want to give it up. Once you have it, you don't want to get rid of it, right? We talk about rent control that way sometimes too, right? People love their Social Security, people love their Medicare. There's a universality to it, right? Which is like what we're, you know, targeted universality is what we're trying to approach with social housing, which is hard, like making sure we're centering a universal program, but also centering people who really need the housing the most. That's difficult. But it is those kind of universalist programs that have so far, knock on wood, stood the test of time. And, you know, I think like that's my answer to that question is like, how are you going to make sure it's not disinvested in? It's like, because like, you know, we're going to make it as universalist as possible. And people will fight for it, right? The same way that they fight for other social programs. And, you know, I think like, I remember, and again, this is a nonpartisan political statement. This is social housing for everybody, regardless of your politics. But I do remember that I think in 2010, when you saw the sort of Tea Party wave, I don't know if there are any Tea Party fans in the audience, but during the Tea Party wave, people mock this, but I kind of like it. There's someone holding a sign that said, "Get your government hands off my Medicare." And that's what that's what I want to see for social housing. If someone out there who doesn't agree with my politics is out there holding a sign saying, "Get your government hands off my social housing," I will be satisfied.
Very nice. Well, Alfonso, Shanti, and Katie, thank you so much for your super thoughtful and inspiring remarks today. I admire you individually and collectively. Thank you for sharing this time. And as I promised, I kick it back to Reverend A. Huang at 11:28.
Thank you. Amazing timing. Thank you so much to Gianpaolo, Alfonso, Margarita, Shanti, Katie, Daniel, and so many others who really made this town hall happen. There are so many questions in the chat in the Q&A section that we just were unable to get to, which just shows us how excited and interested people are in this solution that we need to be able to actually provide real, stable, affordable, secure housing for every single person who lives here. And so it makes me think that we really need a Social Housing 201. We are recording this session and we will be sharing out everything, all the slides as well to all those who registered. So be on the lookout for that. And if you want to stay in touch, please, you can feel free to email me. We are expanding this movement of social housing across the country. And we're still in the throes of figuring out how to do that, how to create that kind of organizing infrastructure we need. So if you email me, I will be happy to stay in touch with you and keep you connected about how we're doing that. And we need you and we need your questions. It's already beginning to help me think about the kinds of things that we need to have prepared in our organizing, between policy to research to education to organizing, to help folks really expand on this movement that we are building together. If you're going to walk away from our session today, the one thing I just want you to know is that this solution of housing can be found by the people who are experiencing it, because the people who experience the challenges are also the people who know the solutions for how to solve their own problems. And so we are building that together. That is the extension and the power of this particular solution. And we encourage you to join in this movement together. So thank you so much for all of your time and be in touch. Thank you again.